A man gets yanked out of his kitchen by Tony Soprano and Silvio Dante because they need him to see about a boat. He barely has time to get dressed. He walks out the door with 2 mob bosses, and he never comes back. Now here's the part people pretend is confusing. The wife doesn't chase them down. She doesn't demand answers. She doesn't cause a scene. Angie just stays quiet. So what is that? Denial? Stupidity? Grief? No. It's the smartest decision in the room. Because in this world, asking the obvious question isn't brave. It's suicidal. Tony and Sil aren't going to tell the truth, and Angie knows it. And the second she forces the conversation, she's not a worried wife anymore. She's a problem that needs managing. And here's the secret nobody says out loud. Angie doesn't just survive his disappearance. She improves. The money shows up. The body shop becomes hers. The marriage she couldn't publicly end ends itself, without the Catholic stigma, without the social humiliation, without the messy divorce. So the real question isn't, why didn't she ask? The real question is, what did Angie already know? And why did staying quiet pay so well? Angie Bonpenciero's apparent lack of curiosity about Sal, Big Pussy Bonpenciero's sudden trip to buy a boat is only mysterious if the surrounding world is treated like a normal one, where spouses ask questions, receive answers, and expect the truth to be something other than a decorative concept. In the ecosystem Angie inhabits, questions are not tools for learning. They are invitations to be lied to, patronized, or quietly punished. The surprise is not that she stays quiet. The surprise is that anyone would expect a different outcome. Start with the basic mechanics of the situation. Tony and Silvio arrive unexpectedly, scoop Pussy up with almost comical haste, and he never returns. This is not a mystery novel with scattered clues and an earnest detective. This is a closed ritual. Buy a boat is not an errand. It is a euphemism, delivered with the same flat efficiency as a hospital code word. Angie is not required to decode it. She only has to understand the rules. Men go out, the story is whatever the men say it is, and women who press too hard discover how quickly family becomes a shield for everyone else and a weapon for them. And, crucially, Angie has lived with Pussy long enough to know how the dance works. He disappears. He resurfaces. He makes excuses. The household adjusts. In that sense, the show has already trained the audience to see Angie's tolerance for absence as habitual, not naive. When he fails to show for Meadow's graduation party, and Angie complains about his inconsideration, it lands because it is familiar. Pussy's vanishing acts long predate the boat. A spouse conditioned to randomness doesn't suddenly become a prosecutor because the randomness turns final. The more interesting question is why Angie would want answers at all. The sentimental reading is that she must be frantic, terrified, desperate for closure. The show, however, spends considerable time demonstrating that Pussy is not a lovable rogue in her private life. He is not a complicated partner with a soft interior. He is dismissive, crude, and increasingly indifferent to her basic humanity. When Angie shares an alarming breast cancer scare, and he responds with the emotional urgency of a man hearing a weather report, the marriage is exposed as a transaction he no longer even pretends to honor. There is a reason Angie tells the other wives that she wanted to vomit when he came home after being missing. That is not the language of longing. That is the language of someone who has mentally left the marriage long before the body is officially removed. So yes, Angie's silence can be read as calculation. It can also be read as relief. These are not mutually exclusive. Toward the end, Pussy becomes the sort of husband whose disappearance functions as an improvement plan. His absence spares her the stigma of divorcing as a Catholic, which matters in that social world because appearances are treated like oxygen. Divorce would be a public declaration of failure, a scarlet letter handed out by the same people who privately understand that the men are routinely unfaithful, violent, and unreliable. Widowhood, on the other hand, is an upgrade in status, tragic, dignified, and, most importantly, socially unassailable. It is suffering without shame, loss without blame. Then there's the material reality, which the series never hides behind moral lectures. Angie's life gets better after Pussy is gone. That is not empowerment as a slogan. It is simple arithmetic. She ends up with the body shop. She receives money floated by Tony, the sort of quiet support that is never framed as charity because the mob cannot admit to being charitable. The implication is regular cash, weekly, monthly, however the arrangement is structured, enough to stabilize her household and allow her to rebuild. In an economy where women are expected to be ornamental dependents, Angie becomes something more dangerous, a woman who earns, not through a hobby business that exists to soothe her conscience, but through actual work that demands competence, negotiation, and constant attention. By the later seasons, she's frequently shown on the phone and preoccupied, not because the writers forgot to give her dialogue, but because her life no longer revolves around being available for gossip lunches. She has responsibilities. She is busy in the way a person is busy when consequences exist. That evolution does not stop at entrepreneurship. Angie begins operating like an associate, an earner in her own right, and eventually slides into the vacuum left when Lorraine Caluso buys the farm. She becomes, in effect, a new Lady Shylock, a female presence in a space that typically tolerates women only as accessories. This is not a fairy tale about breaking glass ceilings. It is a grimly pragmatic story about a woman learning the language of a predatory environment and discovering that competence is a form of armor. Angie's trajectory is one of the sharper bits of the show's social commentary. When the husband is removed, the wife does not automatically collapse. Sometimes she simply stops being interrupted. If that sounds too flattering, the show keeps it balanced. Angie's independence comes with exposure. When Phil Leotardo manipulates and pressures people at the body shop over repairs, Angie can't wave a husband's status like a talisman. She has no built-in protection. Her success is real, but it is also precarious. She is powerful enough to buy herself a car, famously the Corvette she unlocks with casual confidence, yet vulnerable enough to be squeezed by men who assume she is still a widow with a collection plate. Her money is hers, but the world still tries to repossess the idea of her autonomy. This is where Angie becomes less a character and more a mirror held up to Carmela Soprano, who spends years auditioning for the role of independent woman while remaining structurally dependent on Tony's money, influence, and intimidation. Carmela's spec house is regularly framed as enterprise, but its foundation is Tony, his cash, his connections, his ability to lean on inspectors and smooth obstacles. The business is not hers. It is another gift wrapped in the language of self-actualization. Angie, by contrast, does the work herself, earns her own income, and establishes her own ties. That difference is why Carmela's reactions to Angie are so loaded. Carmela can tolerate Angie when Angie is selling sausages in a market, because that version of Angie is a cautionary tale that reassures Carmela of her own status. It triggers anxiety, certainly, because if Tony falls, Carmela could end up in the same place, but it also lets her feel temporarily superior. Then Angie climbs back up through competence, and Carmela is forced to confront the humiliating possibility that the life she considers earned is primarily inherited through marriage. Carmela's jealousy is not loud. It is cultured. She deploys sympathy the way a politician deploys a handshake, performative, strategic, and always angled toward reinforcing hierarchy. The pattern appears elsewhere, most memorably in how she needles Rosalie Aprile in Paris, dragging painful topics into the conversation so Carmela can play the gracious comforter while secretly restoring her own sense of advantage. She does something similar with people she once looked down upon, only to watch them outgrow her judgments, an arc echoed by the late series encounter that highlights how her former assumptions about others' futures were more self-soothing than accurate. Angie's success is intolerable to Carmela because it exposes Carmela's own life as a gilded dependency dressed up as taste. None of this requires Angie to be stupid, and the insistence that she must be either foolish or in denial misses the show's more sophisticated point. In that world, knowing is not binary. There's a spectrum of awareness carefully maintained for survival. Everyone knows, but they do not know. Not in a way that gets said out loud, not in a way that compels action, and certainly not in a way that invites consequences. Angie does not need a confession from Tony or Silvio to understand what happened to her husband. She needs plausible deniability. She needs the kind of silence that keeps her children safe and her business funded. She needs to remain within the unspoken rule. Certain truths are never spoken because speech turns suspicion into accusation, and accusation becomes an event. The evidence that Angie knows is embedded all over the narrative. She witnessed an FBI agent, Skip Lipari, show up at her porch, an intrusion that would make any spouse with functioning pattern recognition start connecting dots. It is entirely reasonable to assume that, in the normal act of dealing with a vanished husband's belongings, she would stumble across recording equipment, perhaps in the humidor where Tony later finds a wire. She may not have cataloged it like an investigator, but she would not need to. The sight of hidden electronics in a mobster's home does not suggest a new hobby. It suggests betrayal. And betrayal, in this world, carries a predictable consequence. The silence afterward is not confusion, it is adaptation. The question of whether the FBI ever came around asking when she last saw him adds another layer of institutional comedy. Law enforcement in this story is often portrayed less as an all-seeing force and more as a bureaucracy hungry for leverage. They adore drug charges because drug charges come with mandatory minimum sentences, and mandatory minimum sentences are a cudgel. Threaten someone with the rest of their life behind bars, then offer mercy as a bargaining chip. Pussy's situation illustrates this dynamic with grim clarity. Once pinned under that weight, his options were largely theoretical. He could have avoided the heroin dealing, borrowed money, sought other income, listened to the warnings from the people who knew the risks. Those were options before the arrest. Afterward, he was trapped between the FBI's appetite and the mob's certainty. The idea that he could simply confess to Tony and be forgiven romanticizes an organization that treats informing as the one sin that cannot be paid off. Tony's line about options is less an offer of salvation than the bitter observation that Pussy had earlier chances to avoid painting himself into a corner. In that sense, Pussy is less a tragic hero than a case study in predictable collapse. Some argue he died too early, that the show could have stretched his arc another season or two, especially since other storylines, like Richie April's abrupt end, proved the series was not afraid of removing major pieces quickly. Even the creative leadership has expressed that extending Pussy's lifespan might have opened interesting possibilities, and certain dream sequence choices can indeed feel neat in a way the show otherwise resists. There is also a practical production side theory, the actor wanting time off, the writers responding with the one kind of no moonlighting rule the story world recognizes. Regardless of which explanation is preferred, the effect is the same. Pussy's exit becomes a pivot point the audience remembers, even if his screen time before that is surprisingly limited. That limited presence is part of why some viewers are startled on rewatch by how little he appears in the first season. He registers in the pilot, adds texture, then drifts into the background until the informant arc grabs him and refuses to let go. That structure invites speculation about whether the informant idea was planned from the start or developed later, especially since the narrative toys with other rat candidates and uses that uncertainty as misdirection. What matters is that, once the show commits, it commits fully. Pussy becomes the embodiment of divided loyalty, messy fear, and the kind of self-deception that curdles into resentment. And resentment is a major part of why Pussy becomes irritating to some and compelling to others. He is not universally beloved. There is a persuasive critique that he is grating, a man whose sense of entitlement rests on history, whose voice and mannerisms can feel exaggerated, whose informant work is clumsy, whose bitterness toward younger crew members reads like insecurity rather than authority, and whose mockery of others comes off as the last refuge of someone who senses he is slipping. Yet even that critique often concedes the performance is strong. The character may be obnoxious, the portrayal is not. This is how the show works at its best. It makes space for characters to be disliked without being poorly written. The informant dynamic itself spawns debate about whether Pussy was effective at playing both sides. One side argues he was surprisingly capable. He fed information when needed, stayed useful, and even pulled off a murder that re-established his credibility. He navigated confrontations with his handler, denied wrongdoing when cornered, then later offered gestures that implicitly acknowledged shared complicity, a dangerous dance that, if recorded, could implicate both parties. The opposing view is less charitable. He had no real skill, merely luck. Tony's favorable bias toward him bought him time, and Skip's increasing emotional entanglement compromised discipline. Under a more paranoid boss or a more rigid handler, Pussy's composting would have happened earlier. From this angle, the real strategists in that world are few: Tony, Silvio, and select others. And most of the crew are impulsive, selfish, and sloppy. Pussy fits comfortably among the sloppy. What is not debatable is how little his wire seems to produce. The story repeatedly implies that the FBI's obsession is less about justice and more about outcomes, tallies, careers. They pressure informants, promise protection, then treat them as disposable. By the time Pussy is killed, the sense is that the Bureau registers his death with bureaucratic annoyance rather than grief. He is, to them, a tool that broke. That indifference mirrors the mob's own. For all the talk of brotherhood, once the wire is confirmed, the verdict is immediate. Which brings the story back to the boat, and the persistent fantasy that Pussy could have talked his way off it. He couldn't, not in any meaningful sense. The decision is made before the engines warm. Once Tony has the recording equipment in hand and the inner circle is mobilized, Pussy is already a corpse taking a field trip. The show communicates this not with speeches, but with faces. Silvio's expression when Tony arrives and announces the outing says everything. There is a fleeting sense of relief at the prospect of delay, as though even executioners would prefer rescheduling. But the momentum does not stop. On the boat, Pussy's admissions only formalize what is already settled. The suggestions for alternate pleas, offers of cash, promises of relocation, elaborate claims about other informants, cinematic threats involving family members, paranoid talk of satellites tracking everything, belong more to desperation theater than strategy. A last-second attempt to redirect suspicion towards someone else might buy minutes in a lesser story. Here, it would likely be interpreted as one final act of manipulation. Even if Pussy offered $200,000 directly, it would not change the central fact. He broke the one rule that cannot be purchased back. He could beg, bargain, grovel, perform loyalty, insist he never truly turned, claim he was feeding disinformation, even attempt to turn the situation into a counterintelligence operation. None of it would matter. Because the execution is not about information. It is about purity. Once the symbol of betrayal attaches to him, he becomes a contamination risk. The only solution the group recognizes is removal. This is why the series can afford moments of grim humor even in the shadow of murder. The world is saturated with euphemisms, absurd nicknames, and banter that functions like insulation against conscience. References to other families with laughably theatrical names, quips that mock the seriousness of macho codes, the sort of sarcastic call and response that punctures tension. These are not deviations. They are part of the culture. The same culture, incidentally, that insists certain sexual acts are taboo for made men, while simultaneously turning those taboos into jokes as soon as alcohol and fear loosen tongues. Pussy's claim, right before his death, that he performed oral sex on a nurse in Puerto Rico is a perfect example. In a universe where men loudly police masculinity through ridiculous prohibitions, the admission lands like a small act of defiance or a sloppy bid for laughter. One explanation is simply intoxication. Alcohol blurs judgment and invites bravado. Another is that Pussy, sensing he is doomed, tries to manufacture a last routine, one final crude story, one last attempt to be one of the guys. There is also the darker reading. He is testing the room, trying to pretend the moment is casual, trying to deny the gravity by acting as though they are just hanging out, drinking, trading jokes. Tony punctures it by pointing out the nurse likely does not exist, and the mood drops. The joke collapses into what it really is, a condemned man improvising normalcy as the walls close in. Meanwhile, Angie's story runs on a different track, a quieter form of survival that draws attention precisely because it is not dramatic. When asked why she does not confront Tony or Silvio, the answer is not a single motive, but an efficient stack of them. She understands there is no point. They would never tell her. She understands the rule about not voicing certain suspicions, because voicing them would force others to respond. She understands, on some level, that her life improves materially with Pussy gone, and she does not intend to sabotage her own stability out of performative grief. She understands that she hated him by the end, that he treated her badly, that the thought of his return once made her physically ill. She understands that her children are grown enough that the household can pivot. She understands that being a Catholic divorcee would come with a lasting social penalty, while being a widow comes with a cloak of untouchable sympathy. She understands that Tony's financial support is not a gift, but a delicate arrangement. And arrangements survive best when no one makes a scene. And perhaps most importantly, she understands the advantage of selective ignorance. In that world, innocence is not purity, it is strategy. Knowing but not knowing is a form of currency. It allows people to continue, to eat manicotti in peace, to pretend the air is clean even as smoke drifts through the room. Angie's silence is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of intelligence adapted to a brutal setting. The intelligence to prioritize safety over catharsis, stability over vengeance, survival over a truth that would arrive too late to help anyone. The show even nods to this collective agreement in small moments later on, such as when Phil Leotardo pokes around the body shop, and someone in the orbit of Pussy's family deflects questions with a blunt refusal to discuss what happened. That is what passes for closure. A wall of silence, reinforced by mutual self-interest and fear. People do not talk about the missing. They build new routines on top of them. So no, Angie Bonpensiero is not a fool who fails to notice the obvious. She is a woman who lives among professionals of denial and understands, better than most, that asking for the truth is often just a request to be humiliated. She chooses not to ask because she already has the answer that matters. Pussy is gone. The men responsible will never confess. The institutions meant to intervene will not restore him, and the life she has left to live is, for the first time in a long time, hers to shape. The silence is not ignorance. It is the sound of a person picking the only sane option available in an insane world. Say nothing, take the money, build the business, and let the men keep their boat story. Hit subscribe if you want more analysis about people trying to stay clean in a world built on mud.